Welcome to part 2 of this masterclass. I really appreciate that you're still around, and I hope you had a lot of fun with part 1, and I hope you picked up a lot of tips there. I know it was tough, but the more you watch it, the more it'll grow on you. And also, just one thing I wanted to hone in, keep doing it yourself. There's watching the tutorials and there's watching me do it, but what really is going to manifest it in your brain is if you just take a pause and just do it yourself over and over. And if there's something that you haven't quite mastered yet, keep going back to it and practice what you currently can't do. As one of those guys at school, a professional musician, Mark Eberman, he told me that. He said, you know, when you practice an instrument, you got to practice what you can't play, because if you keep practicing what you currently can play, then yeah, you'll improve that, but you never master all the other stuff that you currently can't do. So even if it's uncomfortable, keep doing that, because that'll make you a better artist at the end of the day. Having said that, I thought it would be a really good idea to examine why things are the way they are with Genesis Figure and Daz Studio by looking at the history of both the Genesis Figure as well as Daz Studio, as well as Poser for that matter, to understand, well, why things are the way they are. If you are not interested in that, then feel free to skip ahead, but it will certainly help put things into context, and it'll also explain why certain content works with what and why other stuff doesn't work with other figures. So the history of our whole 3D hobbyist content market can literally be traced back to one guy, which is Larry Weinberg. And here's a picture of him. That's Larry. There's only a few pictures on the internet around, and he used to be a computer programmer and an animator in the 80s and 90s back in Hollywood. And his secret mission was to become an illustrator, and he was no good at it really, so he decided to go to an art supply store and get himself one of these. I have one of those as well. I call mine Woody. Hello Woody, how's it going? This is an artist dummy, and it's supposed to help artists find perspective in drawing. So the idea is you put this on your desk and you light it out, and then you take a pen and then you start drawing out what you see there. And of course the problem is, if you don't know how to do it, that's really, really hard. And I found that very, very hard as well. I found that extremely tough. And I can totally understand Larry that he said, look, this isn't for me. This guy is giving me a hard time, and it would be much, much easier. So the problem is that if you look at that in the 3D world, and then you have to put that down on a 2D piece of paper, that's a discrepancy. And not everyone can do that. And I keep trying, and I really am no good at it at all. So Larry thought it would be much, much easier if I can have this guy on a computer screen, pose him as I needed him, and then just trace over that, either as a printout or trace over it on the monitor, whatever. But that would really be the solution. No such program existed back in the early to mid 90s. So Larry, being the programmer that he is, went ahead and wrote it himself. And that then eventually became the first version of Poser. That is a cover here. This was released, Poser version 1 was released in 1995 by a company called Fractal Design. And that is kind of interesting. It was basically his project that he coded at night. He did his day job during the day, and then he coded this at night, and then out comes something that many people took to and thought, my goodness, this is exciting. There's really nothing much in it as far as I can tell. There's really only the basic posing the mannequin, and that was really it. But it was enough for people to say, hey, this thing has potential and we'd like to see more of it. And then of course in the next year, Poser 2 came out, and that came with additional props and more abilities to sculpt this guy or to pose this guy. And this is really how the journey began. And as the team grew that wrote the software, and as also the community around the software grew, came Poser 3. And even the professional industry kind of looked at this and thought, you know what, we don't really have character posing software. We don't have anything that decent humans kind of came out. And that is then what led to the release of Poser 4 and also the Pro Pack for Poser. So that was in 1999. And by that time, the company had changed. It was now called Curious Labs that was publishing Poser. And it was around this time that it became clear that really good content for Poser didn't yet exist. We had the dummy, we had some props, and we had some kind of basic figures. I believe the name Posette might ring a bell to many of you. But they weren't anything like what we have today, like with the Victoria figures or with the Genesis figures, nothing like it at all. So around this time, a company called Zygote, they were into medical digital 3D assets that were extremely realistic assets that could be used for medical illustrations. And they had a little division in their company that would focus on making realistic humans for Poser. So Zygote, the company making content for Poser, that's how it all began back in 1999. And that division of that company in Zygote, the company still exists, Zygote, they still make the same thing that they did back then, but they had this division that kept growing, and these kind of nerds who made content for this hobbyist market, this artistic market, that got split out into its own separate division or its own separate company, which was then known as the Digital Art Zone, DAZ, or Daz as we now know it. The company no longer uses as an acronym. It's just Daz is just, you know, a word and a brand, and that's how it all started. So Curious Labs then took on Poser, and then we got into Poser 5. This was then, we're going to look at the figures in a moment, but just to give you a little bit of a historic overview there, around this time, different versions of Victoria were released. So the first one was, of course, Victoria 1, and I think I have a picture here on Datenbeck's website. Very nice. I'm going to go and show you this. I'll give you links to all these sources that I have in the PDF that accompanies this series. Here's a picture of her, Victoria 1, or when she came out, she was known as the Millennium Woman. So yeah, this is what she looked like. So also not quite like what we know as the Victoria from today, but you can still see the beginnings. And I believe Chris Creek made her. Chris Creek, who later opened his own content store known as Hivewire 3D together with Lisa. She sadly passed away. Chris is still around, but Hivewire is no longer a content store, just as a total aside here. This was Victoria 1, and I believe Zygote didn't quite like the name Millie, so Millennium Woman was kind of shortened to Millie, and I believe Zygote didn't like that, so they named her Victoria. And then after Victoria 1, of course, came Victoria 2. I don't have a picture of her, but there's many other Victorias that we're going to speak about in a moment. There's many, many other generations of Victoria. So then back to the Poser history here, was around this time, 2005, where Curious Labs was bought by another company called eFrontier. And this is kind of when, just about the time when I joined the Poser revolution. I think my first version of Poser was actually this one here, Poser 7. But I had heard of Poser. This is kind of the time that I joined the Daz revolution. And from what I understand, from what I read on forum posts, and from what I understand from artist friends of mine, this time here, just before 2005, it wasn't quite clear if Poser was going to see another release. So the problem was that I believe Curious Labs was struggling to make money, or they wanted to divest themselves of the software, didn't quite know what to do with them, looking for a buyer, but nobody really sprang on it. So the issue was that all the content that Zygote or Daz at this point had produced might not have a software to live on in, and that would have been a problem. So not knowing what the future for Poser would hold, Daz took it onto themselves to say, hey, let's make our own software that would assure that our content can live on. So literally as a backup plan, that then became Daz Studio 1, which was released kind of around this time, 2004, 2005. I don't have an exact date there. I'm afraid the sources are a little scarce there. But after that, shortly after that, came Daz Studio 2. This, I remember using that, actually. I still have that. And then came Daz Studio 3. I remember there was a good beta version, and then, there's a lot more content that was added there with Daz Studio 3. And then 4, which is more or less still the version that we use today, just with much, much more added features on it. So this is really why there is Poser, and also why there is Daz Studio, because it wasn't quite clear if Poser was going to see another day. Thankfully it did, when it was namely bought by a company called eFrontier. And then they kept updating and selling Poser until it was sold to Smith Micro a couple of years later. Smith Micro then also had other creative softwares in their package, like Manga Studio, which then later became Clip Studio Paint, as well as what used to become Moho, which was then Anime Studio. And so they sold all that. And today, Poser is owned by a company called Bondware, which are the owners of Renderosity. And that is now basically their software product for the Poser content, which you can now find at Renderosity. And Daz are no longer supplying content for the Poser market. We'll see in the figure generations why there was a split there. But yeah, we all owe it all to Larry that this is really what we're having fun with. So thanks, Larry. Very kind of you. So then back to the figure generations here. Victoria 3 and Victoria 4 and also Victoria 2 and 1, they had issues in that they all were a separate mesh. So there was not just Victoria's, there was also related figures like Stephanie and Aiko and all these figure shapes that we still remember, like the girl, and then of course Michael, the male figure, and also the Brute, and people like that, the guy and stuff like that. They all were based on an individual mesh each. And as a result, it means that if I have a shirt for Victoria and I want to fit that onto Stephanie, it's just not going to fit. There's no auto following. It's basically somebody with knowledge of a 3D editor needs to go in and hammer and chisel away at it so that it fits another figure. There's no D-force, there's no cloth room at this point. So it's difficult to make one item of clothing fit multiple figures, and that's a problem. So that's why Daz then came out, and after the release of Victoria 4.2, which we had for quite a while, they released something called Genesis. And the beauty of Genesis, I'm going to go and show you this inside Daz Studio here. The beauty of Genesis is that it's one mesh that can morph itself into various shapes. That includes the male as well as the female shape, but also things like zombies and monsters and muscly people and children. Let me show you how it works. So this is the yellow thing here. That's the Genesis starter essentials that you get for free from the store. And if I load that, out comes this androgynous figure in an A pose. And this is basically how Character Creator still do it. The iClone guys, Reallusion, they still base their main base mesh onto one mesh, and they can turn into man or woman. So I can either go and load these things in from here, or I can head over to my parameters tab and then go and see if I search for basic. I can dial in the basic female, and then my little guy turns into a female. Or I can go dial this out, turn it into a basic male with slightly broader shoulders, or I can turn it into a basic child. So that is quite revolutionary, or anything in between. So I don't have to go from here to there. I can literally go and turn him into a teenager if I wanted to. So that is kind of cool. And then the other good thing is that the clothing that I might put on my person here will follow. So if I go and put this on, and then might also put some trousers on here without the pants. So the cool thing is that this is now going to follow. If I go and put this into like basic female mode again, then my female can in fact wear this. And the clothing follows, and there's only minimal poke through. If there is, then we already know if and how to fix it. So this is thanks to the smoothing modifier that I've explained. Or I can go and turn this into a male. Or I can also dial in things like muscle morphs and stuff. I'm not sure if I have them installed here, but I can also turn this into a child now, or into a teenager, and every bit of clothing will still work with the figure. And that's kind of the magic about the Genesis figure. So it's not a different shape as such. It's one base mesh, and all we have is so-called deltas, which are morph targets. So a delta or morph just under the hood is essentially two OBJs. One's the base mesh that's in here, the Genesis figure, and then we have the same mesh in an editing program, and we shape it without changing the vertex order. So we don't add points to it, we don't remove points from it, we just move the points around and thereby creating a different shape. And then we can go and import this back into Daz Studio as what's known as a morph, with a little tool called Morph Loader, and that allows us to literally create one of these sliders here, and that tells Daz Studio, hey, this figure is identical to that, just move these points around as I've just done and create a slider. And Daz Studio says, okay, I'll do that. And that's kind of the magic behind these things. So if I go and search for something else, I mean, I have other figures here that I have installed for this demonstration. There's also not just people, you can also turn them into monsters, and even their clothing kind of still works. I mean, yeah, there's a little bit of ripped poke through now, but we have seen how to fix that. So that's just, cranking up the smoothing modifier. You can see that the clothing literally just shapes itself with the figure, and that is kind of magical. And this is what Victoria 5 is based on, and Michael 5, and anything that has the number 5 in the name. I have her here. This is Victoria 5, and she looks beautiful. Absolutely. This is all based on that Genesis figure. And what's even more impressive about this is that all these renders are done in 3Delight. So the CPU-based engine that isn't a PBR engine, that's a biased render engine. And that is how good 3Delight is. So if somebody says, yeah, iRay is categorically better than 3Delight, not the case. It's a different approach, and with a lot of work, you can get these types of results that are photorealistic, which is very impressive. It just takes a long time to render, and especially back in the days, we didn't have that hardware that we have today. So very, very impressive what you can get out of 3D Light. Yeah, so that's Genesis. And then as Genesis, so there's one problem with this approach, and that was that based on the androgynous shape here, it was difficult for clothing creators to, I'm going to send this back to 0. It was difficult for clothing creators to accentuate the features of the male and the female form. And they preferred it that they had 2 separate bases, one for the male and one for the female. So that is what happened with the next generation of Genesis, which was Genesis Generation 2. And that's what Victoria 6 is based on. So she is now still 3D Light, but that's now based on Genesis 2. And in that, we have a male and a female basic shape. Let me go back to the starter essentials here. That's them, the Genesis 2, the Genesis starter essentials, the 2 and the 3 and the 8, as well as the D-Force and the default resources. They're all available for free from the Daz store. So in here, I'm going to just quickly show you that there is a basic male and a basic female. They both look very similar to the Genesis 1 figure, but one is already dialed up with a male and one's already dialed up with a female morph. So they're now 2 individual bases. That is still 3D Light, and you can see that there's enhanced detail now on the body, so it's easier for people to make clothing with it. And it's just, Genesis 1 was a great experiment, and many people still use it for the fact that you need one item of clothing for any type of figure you want to make with it. And it's also kind of a popular solution for game engines still, so that's where Genesis still comes in. But it evolved into Genesis 2 in, I believe, when was it, 2013? That's when this came out. And yeah, so quite nice. And then, of course, you had the Michael version. So anything that has a 6 in the name, that is based on Genesis 2. And they're quite often on sale these days. That's Victoria 6, Michael 6, and Monique 6, and all these people are all based on that. Also, one thing that started happening during this time is that HD versions of figures came out. So the difference between that and the base figure is that there's enhanced geometry in the figure. So the shape of the person and the skin shader is essentially the same, but you'll see more enhanced geometry on these areas here. So if you look really close, you can see it. It's not always immediately obvious, and in today's figures, you'll see it a lot more pronounced. So here we can see these are the regular lips of the regular Victoria 6 figure, and these are the lips for the HD version. So there is more detail going on, especially also in kind of fingers and knees, and not so much on the body. It's very, very difficult to see this here, especially in the render, but you can see it on the fingers. It's kind of creeping in. Nowadays, you have a much higher subdivision level on the HD figures, and you see a very big difference, especially on lips and where there's wrinkles like knees and stuff. You can see really well here. So this is now not faked with normal maps or with displacement maps or whatnot. This is sculpted in detail. And this is made possible with a technology that lets creators work on a subdivided figure outside of Daz Studio and then bring the subdivided figure back into Daz Studio and create what's known as a HD morph. And hence the word HD everywhere. So that's one other advantage that crept in with this. Now the next generation, 2 years later, we're talking Victoria 7, based on the Genesis 3 male and female technology that's happening there. So this is now very different to Genesis 2 in that the rigging has changed, but also we now have a new render engine in Daz Studio called the NVIDIA iRay engine. So in addition to 3D Light, we now have a fully fledged PBR engine that is easier to get well-lit results out of because of the shader technology that's completely different. And this is now Victoria 7, and she is based on Genesis 3. Very interesting. So the rigging has changed from something called triax to something called dual quaternion. I gotta be brutally honest, I don't really know the differences. All I do know is that the dual quaternion is something that other 3D applications use more and prefer more, including game engines. And that's partly why Daz have made that change, because that's more widely adapted in the humanoid characters that are currently used in other technologies. So they wanted to be compatible with that. So that was one change. And then, of course, we had this new render engine, so that from now on, we have 2 types of material presets in Daz Studio, one for 3D Light and one for iRay. And that continues to this day. Even though iRay has become more like the norm, we find more products that have iRay only shaders and don't have 3D Light shaders anymore. We'll talk more about that in a later part of this course. But yes, that was the Genesis 3 generation. And then another couple of years later, we're talking Victoria 8, which is now based on Genesis 8. And first of all, you'll see that the Victoria versions have increased from 5, 6, 7, and 8, but the Genesis figure generations have changed from 1, 2, 3, and then we go to 8. And that is to avoid confusions and basically bring the numbers in line with one another. That's the only background. We already had an important figure with the number 4 in it. So they thought, you know what, let's go and call Genesis the same number as we call our figure generation. So there's Michael 8, and there's Victoria 8, and there's Stephanie 8, and there's Monique 8, and there's Darius 8, and everyone with the number 8 in it now belongs to Genesis 8. So there's no more guessing which generation was that again. So yeah, that's basically the reason. There's a couple of things that have changed from Genesis 3 going into Genesis 8. The first one is that the figure now appears in an A pose rather than a T pose when you load them in. So the T pose was something that's been around for literally ever, but the A pose is easier if you have cloth simulation engines. So if you infer something from an A pose to an actual standing pose, it is less stretchy here in the shoulder. So if you lift your shoulder up, you literally feel that your shirt is almost pulling out of your pants. And that is being avoided with the A pose. It's less extreme as a resting pose than the T pose. And once again, it's something that is more widely adopted in the industry. So Daz followed suit and has now adopted the A pose as a new general thing. The other thing that we now have in Genesis 8 is that we have a fully exposed facial rig that lets us dial in morphs on the face easier with power poles, and we'll talk more about this later. But yes, those are the two main differences. The shaders have also been improved, as they always are. When you have new figure generations, there's usually some improvements in the human skin shader. So it is now easier for us to do expressions on the Genesis 8 figure. The facial rig was already there in Genesis 3, but it was still a little bit hidden, and now it's fully exposed in Genesis 8. So still very, very good figure generation to work with. I really like the Genesis 8 figure. But of course, we don't want to just leave it there. There's yet another generation after that, and that is, of course, Genesis 8.1, an incremental update into Genesis on which we now have people like Victoria 8.1 and Michael 8.1 that are based on this now. If you look closely, every Victoria figure looks a little bit different, and they're not really meant to be the same person. They're all different people, and they share the name. She's also available without tattoos, by the way, so this is not, you're not obliged to use the tattoos, but yeah, there we go. This is her without tattoos. So different people, different height, different body proportions, just a completely different person. And shader improvements have happened, but also the figure now comes in with a higher default subdivision resolution. So rather than subdivision resolution 1, we now talk 2 and 3 in the new characters, and that's just to imply more detail in the figure as we render her. That has implications, which is why I'm devoting a whole video to what subdivision is, why we have it, and how to avoid hiccups when you're moving 8.1 figures in your viewport and you think, hey, this is really, really sluggish. Am I making it up? No, you're not. Your computer's working literally 4 times as hard with Genesis 8.1 figures, and I'll show you a way how to avoid that in the next video. Yeah, so that's Victoria 8.1. The other change that we have with Genesis 8.1 is that we now have a faceplate that comes with the character that conforms to the FACS facial system. That means we can now load up and create extremely realistic facial morphs and facial movements so that we can either animate the faces or get extremely good expressions out. Something that is available as an add-on product for Genesis 3 and 8. If you're working with those characters, I highly recommend you buy it. It's called Face Controls. I'll talk more about this later in this course because I use this product all the time. It's not just the faceplate, but it's also the excellent expressions that come with it and how we can blend them together using Puppeteer. So lots of exciting stuff that we can do with this. Beautiful renders, and a lot of them. I could just look at these things for hours. I'm glad I could share this with you. That's Victoria 8.1, and of course then her counterpart Michael 8.1. That is basically all there is to say about Daz Studio and the history of the Victoria and the Michael figure and why we have Genesis and so many generations. There's just one thing that we should be aware of, and that is that content that was made for a previous figure generation doesn't necessarily work with the current generation. So Genesis 8 content works with the Genesis 8 figure. It also works with the 8.1 figure, so that works as well. Content made for 8.1 does not work on the 8 figure. Likewise, content that was made for Genesis 3 or 2 can be used on Genesis 8 with the technique called auto-fitting, but that often brings less than desirable results, especially in flaring dresses. That doesn't look great. So I recommend you use Genesis 8 content with Genesis 8 and 8.1, Genesis 3 content with Genesis 3, Genesis 2 content with Genesis 2, and so forth. There are clothing converters available, but it's a compromise compared to the real deal. There are also ways to bring Genesis 3 content onto Genesis 8 without auto-fitting. I've discussed this on my YouTube channel in a video, thanks to my supporter Mike, who brought this to my attention. But it's not something I'm going to be discussing here. Just as a rule of thumb, Genesis 8 content with Genesis 8 and 8.1, Genesis 3 content with Genesis 3, and so forth. And that is all I wanted to tell you, I think we have everything. I thought it's really helpful to put this into context and understand where we are today and why things are the way they are. And in the next episode, we're going to talk more about how we can blend these characters in with one another, where and how we can find these figure shapes on a particular generation, and then how we can kind of build a dream character just with a bunch of morph dials and how we can have a lot of fun with that. Stay tuned for that.